My ex-wife showed up at my door at 6 in the morning with bruises on her arm and what looked like hickeys on her neck, asking if we could talk. She had that same sad puppy dog look she used to use when she wanted something from me. During our marriage. You know, the one where she'd tilt her head slightly and make her eyes all wide and vulnerable. The thing is, I'd seen this exact performance before. Back when she was still my wife and wanted a new car or a vacation we couldn't afford, or when she'd been caught in a lie and needed me to forgive her. It was her go-to manipulation tactic, and honestly, it used to work pretty well on me. But that was before she decided the grass was greener with our unemployed neighbor and walked out on our 10-year marriage and 2 kids. That was before she spent months telling everyone who'd listened that I was boring, that I wasn't exciting enough for her anymore, that she deserved better than a stable guy who just paid all the bills and took care of everything. When she tried to step closer and give me one of those reconciliation hugs, I stepped back. Not happening. The kids were still sleeping upstairs, and I wasn't about to let her drama wake them up or confuse them about what was actually going on. She tried the sad puppy dog look that used to work. Let me back up and explain how we got to this point. For 10 years, I was the reliable husband who paid all the bills while she stayed home with our 2 kids. I'm not complaining about that arrangement. Someone needed to be home with the children, and my job in IT provided enough income to support our family comfortably. She never worked during our marriage, which seemed fine at the time, since childcare would have eaten up most of whatever salary she could have earned anyway. I handled the mortgage, the car payments, the insurance, the groceries, the utilities, the kids' school expenses, and pretty much every other financial responsibility you can imagine. She handled the household and the children, and for the most part, it worked. We weren't rich, but we were stable. The kids had what they needed. We took occasional family vacations, and I thought we had built something solid together. I was the reliable husband who paid all the bills. What I didn't know was that she'd been feeling increasingly restless about our boring life. Apparently, while I was at work providing for our family, she'd been spending a lot of time talking to our next-door neighbor, who was recently divorced and unemployed. He had time to hang out during the day, to listen to her complaints about how predictable and unexciting our marriage had become. When I found out about the affair, her explanation was brutally simple. I wasn't exciting enough for her anymore. I was too focused on responsibility and stability. I never took risks or did anything spontaneous. I was, in her words, boring as hell, and she deserved to feel alive again. The unemployed neighbor apparently made her feel alive in ways that I never could. She had a whole speech prepared about how she'd outgrown our marriage and needed someone who understood her need for adventure and passion. The irony that this passionate man was living off unemployment benefits while I was working 50-hour weeks to support our family was apparently lost on her. She said I wasn't exciting enough for her anymore. The divorce process was surprisingly straightforward. She was confident that she was upgrading to a better life, so she didn't fight too hard on the settlement terms. I kept the house. She got a modest alimony payment for 2 years, and we split custody of the kids 50-50. She seemed eager to start her new life and wasn't interested in dragging things out. She kept talking about how much happier she was going to be, how the grass was definitely greener on the other side, how she'd finally found someone who appreciated her for who she really was. She was absolutely glowing with the certainty that she'd made the right choice and that I'd eventually realize what I'd lost. She was so sure the grass was greener. The first signs that her new life wasn't quite the fairy tale she'd imagined started showing up about 3 months after the divorce was finalized. It was subtle at first, just little things I noticed during our custody exchanges when she'd drop off or pick up the kids. She'd always been good at putting on a show, but now her cheerfulness had this forced quality to it, like she was performing happiness rather than actually feeling it. When she picked up our daughter at 6:03 on Tuesday evenings, She'd have this bright smile plastered on her face, but I could see the strain in her eyes. When she dropped off our son at 6:32 on Sunday mornings, she'd chat enthusiastically about how great everything was going, but her voice had this slightly manic edge to it. The kids started mentioning little things too. Mommy seemed tired a lot. Mommy and her boyfriend argued sometimes, but quietly so the kids wouldn't hear. Mommy had been looking for a job, but hadn't found anything yet. Nothing dramatic, just small cracks in the perfect new life she'd been so excited about. Her happiness looked like hard work. The real eye-opener came when I was at the grocery store and saw her boyfriend's truck parked in what used to be my parking spot. I'd lived in that neighborhood for 8 years, shopped at that same store twice a week, and always parked in the same general area. Seeing his beat-up pickup in my spot felt like some kind of territorial pissing contest, like he was trying to claim not just my ex-wife, but every piece of the life I'd built. It was petty, I know, but it bothered me more than it should have. Here was this unemployed guy living off my ex-wife's alimony payments, driving around in a truck that probably hadn't been washed since the Clinton administration. And somehow, he thought he was the winner in this situation. Some territories aren't worth claiming. About 6 months after the divorce, the financial reality of her new situation started hitting hard. The alimony I was paying covered some of her expenses, but apparently not all of them. Her boyfriend's unemployment benefits weren't exactly what you'd call a reliable income stream, and finding a job after being out of the workforce for 10 years was proving more challenging than she'd anticipated. The first sign came when I got a text from her at exactly 15:56 on a Tuesday, a utility bill screenshot attached, asking if I could help with the electric bill this month because she was a little short. The message was casual, almost like she was asking a friend for a small favor, rather than requesting financial assistance from the ex-husband she'd left for being too boring and financially focused. 2 weeks later, another text at 16:11. Hey, could you cover half of Katie's soccer registration? I know it's my week to pay, but things are tight right now. She even included a photo of the registration form, like visual evidence would somehow make her request more compelling. I have to admit, there was a certain satisfaction in watching this train wreck unfold. The woman who'd told me I was too focused on money and stability was now desperately focused on money and stability herself. Turns out, excitement doesn't pay the electric bill. What was fascinating was how she'd completely forgotten how to ask for help directly. During our marriage, if she wanted something, she'd just ask. But now, everything was wrapped in layers of pride, justification, and manipulation. She couldn't simply say, "I need money." It had to be framed as temporary setbacks, unexpected expenses, or opportunities for me to be a better co-parent. The requests started coming through the kids too, which really crossed a line. Our son would mention that, "Mommy said to ask Daddy if he could help with groceries this week because the unemployment check was late." Our daughter would casually drop that, "Mommy's really worried about the car payment and wondered if you might want to help out, since you care about us having safe transportation." That using our children as unwitting messengers for her financial desperation was manipulative and unfair. These kids didn't need to be burdened with adult money problems, and they definitely didn't need to feel responsible for solving their mother's poor life choices. She'd forgotten how to ask for help directly. My responses to these requests were consistently polite, but absolutely firm. When she texted about utility help, I reminded her that our divorce settlement included specific provisions for child-related expenses, and her personal bills weren't part of my obligations. When she wanted help with soccer registration during her assigned week, I suggested she contact the program about payment plans or financial assistance options. When the kids started delivering her financial messages, I told them gently but clearly that money conversations were strictly between adults, and they should never feel responsible for helping solve grown-up problems. I explained that their only job was to be kids and enjoy their childhood, not to worry about bills or payments. Every single time she tested my boundaries, I held firm. The divorce was final, the settlement was fair and legal, and her financial struggles with her exciting new boyfriend were simply not my problem to solve. I'd spent 10 years being the reliable provider who fixed everything, and I wasn't about to extend that exhausting role into our post-divorce relationship. She kept expecting me to swoop in and rescue her from the natural consequences of her choices, but those days were permanently over. I had my own life to rebuild, my own financial goals to pursue, and my own hard-earned lessons about setting healthy boundaries with people who don't respect them. I don't care about your problems anymore. About 8 months after the divorce, the situation started getting genuinely concerning. The kids began coming back from their mother's house with stories that made me pay closer attention to what was happening over there. It started small, our son mentioning at 21:47 on a Thursday evening that Mommy's boyfriend gets really mad when things are loud. Our daughter casually describing how Mommy has to be extra careful about keeping the house clean now. Then came the unexplained injuries. A bruise on our daughter's shoulder that she said came from bumping into a door. Our son with scratches on his arm that he couldn't quite explain. When I asked them directly about these marks, they'd get quiet and change the subject, which worried me more than the injuries themselves. The mood changes were the most telling sign. These kids used to be excited about going to their mom's house, but now they seemed subdued before visits and relieved when they came back to my place. They started asking if they could stay extra days with me, making excuses about school projects or friend visits that required them to be at my house instead of theirs. The kids started talking about Mommy's new normal. Meanwhile, the neighbors were getting quite the entertainment show. I heard from several people that there'd been shouting matches loud enough to be heard from the street, usually around 16:35 when her boyfriend came home from whatever job hunting he'd supposedly been doing that day. One neighbor mentioned seeing my ex-wife crying in her car outside the house, apparently afraid to go inside. The pattern was becoming predictable. Financial stress would build throughout the week, leading to arguments that escalated into screaming matches, followed by periods where my ex-wife would be extra careful about everything she did. Her social media posts, which used to be full of photos with her exciting new boyfriend, had completely stopped. The woman who couldn't wait to show off her upgraded life was suddenly very quiet about what that life actually looked like. People in the neighborhood started asking me careful questions about whether everything was okay over at my old house. The polite way neighbors have of saying they're witnessing what looks like domestic trouble without wanting to get directly involved. The whole neighborhood was watching the train wreck. The desperation in her communication with me became increasingly obvious and creative. Phone calls that used to come once a week for scheduling issues were now happening every few days with increasingly dramatic reasons why she needed my help, my understanding, or my intervention in various crises. She started using emotional manipulation tactics I hadn't seen since the worst days of our marriage. Sudden health scares that needed immediate attention and support. Family emergencies that required my involvement as the kid's father. Financial catastrophes that threatened the children's stability and well-being. The most concerning escalation was how she began coaching the kids to deliver increasingly personal messages. They'd come back with requests for me to check on Mommy because she's been sad, or suggestions that maybe Daddy could visit sometime to make sure everything's okay. Using our children as emotional messengers was a new low even for her. These kids were already dealing with enough stress from whatever was happening in that house. They didn't need to be turned into tiny therapists responsible for managing their mother's emotional crisis. Desperation was making her creative. At some point, watching this train wreck from the sidelines wasn't enough anymore. I needed to know exactly what my children were being exposed to, and I needed documentation that would hold up if this situation required legal intervention. So I hired a private investigator to get an objective assessment of what was happening at my ex-wife's house. The PI's first report arrived with photos time-stamped at 23:38 on a Tuesday night, showing my ex-wife's boyfriend's truck parked outside a bar 3 towns over while she was supposedly home with the kids. Additional surveillance revealed a pattern of him disappearing for days at a time, leaving her alone with no transportation and no explanation of where he'd gone or when he'd be back. But the most damaging evidence came in the form of text message screenshots the PI managed to obtain. At 24:22, she'd texted her sister, "I don't know how much more of this I can take. He gets so angry over nothing." At 29:40, another message to the same sister, "The kids keep asking questions about the yelling. I don't know what to tell them." And at 30:15, the most revealing text of all, "I think I made a huge mistake leaving my name. At least he never made me walk on eggshells in my own house." The technology made it easy to document the reality she was trying so hard to hide from everyone, including herself. Pictures don't lie like people do. When I sat down with the kids individually to ask them direct questions about their experiences at their mother's house, their answers painted an even clearer picture of what was happening. Our son, who was 9, described having to be really quiet when Mommy's boyfriend was home because he doesn't like kid noises. He'd witnessed several arguments where the boyfriend called their mother names I won't repeat, and he'd seen her crying in the kitchen afterward. Our daughter, who was 7, told me about having to help Mommy clean the house perfectly before the boyfriend came home, because he checks everything and gets mad if it's not right. She'd seen her mother apologizing for things that weren't her fault, and she'd learned to hide in her room when the adults started using angry voices. Both children described feeling scared and confused about the difference between their mom's house and their dad's house. They understood that different rules applied in different places, but they couldn't understand why their mother seemed so different, more nervous, more sad, more careful about everything she did. The most heartbreaking testimony came when our son asked me directly, "Why does Mommy's boyfriend not like us? Did we do something wrong?" These children were blaming themselves for the toxic environment they were being forced to live in half the time. Kids see everything adults try to hide. The physical evidence became impossible to ignore when my ex-wife showed up for a custody exchange with visible bruises and what were clearly Hickeys marking her neck and arms. This was at 36:41 on a Saturday afternoon when she was dropping off the kids after her weekend. When our daughter asked innocently, "Mommy, what happened to your arm?" my ex-wife quickly pulled down her sleeves and made up some story about falling down the stairs. But the bruising pattern didn't match a fall. It looked exactly like finger marks from someone grabbing her roughly. 2 weeks later, at 38:08 during another pickup, the evidence was even more obvious. Fresh Hickeys covered her neck, but more disturbing were the defensive wounds on her forearms and the way she flinched when I moved too quickly while reaching for the kids' backpacks. She was exhibiting classic signs of someone living in an abusive relationship. The neighbors had started documenting incidents too. Mrs. Patterson from next door had been keeping a log of the loud arguments the times police cars drove slowly by the house and the occasions when my ex-wife would sit in her car in the driveway for long periods, apparently afraid to go inside. Mr. Rodriguez across the street mentioned seeing the boyfriend throwing things out of the house during arguments, and he'd witnessed my ex-wife picking up broken items from the yard the next morning. The whole neighborhood was becoming an unwitting collection of witnesses to a domestic situation that was spiraling completely out of control. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The woman who'd left me because I was too boring and stable was now trapped in a relationship with someone who was exciting in all the worst possible ways. The grass she'd thought was greener was actually a minefield, and she was learning that the hard way. Her body was telling the story she wouldn't. As the evidence mounted, and her situation became more desperate, my ex-wife's manipulation tactics reached new levels of creativity and pathetic desperation. The fake emergencies started coming weekly, sudden medical crises that required my immediate attention, financial disasters that threatened the children's stability, and family emergencies that somehow always needed my specific intervention to resolve. She'd call crying about a mysterious illness that doctors couldn't diagnose conveniently, timing these health scares to coincide with times when I'd been particularly firm about boundaries. The emotional appeals became increasingly dramatic, threats of self-harm. If I didn't show more compassion for her situation, claims that she was having panic attacks because of my coldness toward her struggles. The pattern was predictable and transparent. Every time her boyfriend disappeared for days, every time the bills piled up, beyond what her alimony could cover, every time the reality of her choices became too obvious to ignore, she'd manufacture a crisis that required my rescue. It was the same playbook she'd used during our marriage when she wanted something she couldn't directly ask for. She was running out of cards to play. The most infuriating escalation came when she started coaching our children to deliver increasingly personal and manipulative messages. Our daughter would come back with carefully rehearsed speeches about how Mommy cries a lot and thinks Daddy doesn't love us anymore. Our son would repeat word-for-word conversations about how Mommy says she's scared and needs Daddy to help her feel safe again. The emotional blackmail was blatant and cruel. She was teaching our children to weaponize their own emotions against me, turning them into unwitting accomplices in her manipulation campaigns. The kids didn't understand they were being used. They genuinely believed they were helping their mother by delivering these messages, and they were confused and hurt when I didn't respond with the immediate rescue attempts she was expecting. The most offensive instance came when she had our son tell me that Mommy said if Daddy really loves us, he'll come talk to her about important things. She was using our children's need for family stability to pressure me into breaking the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. She crossed the line when she used our kids. That was when I decided this train wreck needed to end permanently, at least as far as my family was concerned. I contacted my lawyer to discuss modifying the custody arrangement based on the documented evidence of the unstable environment at her house. The physical evidence, the PI reports, the neighbor testimonies, and especially the children's accounts, painted a clear picture of a situation that was harmful to their well-being. I started documenting every interaction with her, recording phone calls legally in accordance with state laws, and keeping detailed logs of the children's reports about their experiences at their mother's house. The manipulation attempts, the coaching of children, the visible injuries. Everything was being documented with timestamps and witness accounts. My strategy was simple: establish an unbreakable boundary that protected my children, while making it clear that her personal choices and their consequences were entirely her responsibility to manage. No more rescue attempts, no more emotional support, no more financial assistance beyond what was legally required. Time to end this train wreck permanently. The final confrontation happened in the grocery store parking lot during what was supposed to be a routine custody exchange. My ex-wife showed up 20 minutes late, which wasn't unusual, but this time she came with a full arsenal of desperate manipulation tactics and an audience of afternoon shoppers who were about to get quite the show. She approached my car with that same sad puppy dog look from months ago, but now it was accompanied by visible bruising on her neck and arms that she'd clearly forgotten to cover up properly. The desperation in her eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't just about getting sympathy anymore. This was about survival. "Please, we need to talk," she said, loud enough for the family loading groceries into their van nearby to hear every word. "I know I made mistakes, but I need your help. The kids need their father to step up and help their mother through a difficult time." When I calmly declined and started to get the children's backpacks from my trunk, she escalated her performance. The tears started flowing, the voice got higher and more dramatic, and she began recounting a litany of supposed emergencies that required my immediate intervention. "You're being cruel and vindictive," she announced to the parking lot. "I'm the mother of your children, and you're just going to let me suffer because your ego is hurt." That's when I decided it was time for the whole neighborhood to see the truth. The next week, I had a scheduled meeting with my tax accountant to discuss the financial implications of the modified custody arrangement my lawyer was pursuing. What my ex-wife didn't know was that I'd been systematically documenting every financial aspect of our post-divorce relationship, and the numbers painted a very clear picture of who was actually thriving. My accountant spread out the documents showing my income savings investments and financial growth over the past year since the divorce. My career had flourished without the constant drama and emotional drain of my marriage. I'd received 2 promotions, increased my salary by 30%, and built up a substantial emergency fund that provided real security for my children's future. In contrast, the documentation of my ex-wife's financial situation told a very different story. The alimony payments I was making represented nearly 60% of her total income. Her boyfriend's unemployment benefits had been exhausted months ago, and there was no evidence of him contributing anything meaningful to their household expenses. The PI reports showed a pattern of financial instability that went far beyond normal post-divorce adjustment difficulties. Utility shut-off notices, overdue rent warnings, and credit card debt accumulation painted a picture of someone who had fundamentally misjudged the economic realities of her choices. The difference in financial stability between the 2 households is significant, my accountant noted matter-of-factly. Your ex-wife appears to be entirely dependent on alimony and government assistance, while your financial position has actually improved since the divorce. Numbers don't lie about who's really thriving. That evening, my ex-wife called for what would turn out to be our final conversation as anything resembling co-parents. She'd apparently heard through mutual acquaintances about my financial success, and she wanted one last chance to convince me to rescue her from the consequences of her choices. "I know you hate me," she began, "but can't you see that I'm drowning? I made a mistake leaving you, and I'm paying for it every day. The kids deserve to have their mother in a stable situation, and you have the power to help make that happen." I listened to her entire speech without interrupting, noting how she'd crafted each sentence to manipulate different aspects of guilt responsibility and parental duty. It was actually impressive in its calculated desperation. When she finished, I gave her my final answer with complete calm and clarity. The divorce is final. The custody arrangement is being modified to protect our children, and your personal financial struggles are not my responsibility. You chose excitement over stability, and now you're experiencing the long-term consequences of that choice. I will continue to fulfill my legal obligations as a father, but I will not rescue you from the life you chose. She tried one last manipulation attempt, bringing up the kids' supposed confusion about why Daddy wouldn't help Mommy. But I cut her off. Our children are learning an important lesson about choices and consequences. They're seeing that actions have results, and that people are responsible for the lives they create for themselves. That's actually a valuable education. I ended the call and blocked her number, keeping only the communication channels required for legal custody matters. The emotional manipulation, the financial requests, the manufactured emergencies. All of it was permanently ended with that conversation. The grass was never greener. You just couldn't see clearly. In the months that followed, my ex-wife's situation continued its predictable downward spiral. The neighbor who'd been documenting incidents told me that the police had been called to the house twice more, and that she'd been seen moving boxes into a storage unit with the help of her sister. Apparently, her exciting boyfriend had finally left for good, taking her remaining furniture and whatever dignity she had left. The support system she'd once relied on, her family, her friends, her social circle, had gradually distanced themselves from the chaos she'd created. Even her sister, who'd been her main emotional support, had reportedly grown tired of the constant crisis calls and manipulation attempts. From what I heard through the small-town gossip network, she'd moved into a low-income apartment and was working part-time at a retail job, struggling to make ends meet on the limited income her new reality provided. The woman who'd left a comfortable middle-class life for excitement was now experiencing the long-term consequences of that choice in the most direct way possible. She finally understood what she'd thrown away. Meanwhile, my life with the children had settled into a peaceful, stable routine that felt like what family life was supposed to be. The kids thrived in an environment without constant tension and drama. Their grades improved, their stress levels decreased, and they started laughing more. Genuine, happy childhood laughter that I'd missed hearing during the chaotic years. My career continued to flourish without the emotional drain of managing someone else's poor decisions. I'd been promoted again, purchased a larger home with a yard where the kids could play safely, and even started dating someone who appreciated stability and shared my values about family and responsibility. The boundaries I'd established weren't just protecting me from my ex-wife's manipulation. They were protecting my children's future and teaching them valuable lessons about self-respect and personal responsibility. Sometimes, the best revenge is living well. Looking back, I realized that the most important lesson from this entire experience was about recognizing the difference between temporary excitement and sustainable happiness. My ex-wife had confused drama with passion instability, with adventure, and neediness with love. The grass isn't actually greener anywhere else. It's only greener where you take the time and effort to water it, fertilize it, and care for it, consistently. She'd abandoned a well-tended lawn for what looked like a more exciting landscape, only to discover it was actually a swamp. The grass is only greener where you water it.